Introduction to the Undertaker. The graveyard stretched endlessly beneath a gray sky, its tombstones worn and jagged like forgotten memories. The wind whispered through the cracked stone, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and old secrets. There was a stillness in the air, a kind of silence that felt heavier than it should, as if the very ground beneath the graves held its breath. Among the stones, a solitary figure moved. Cloaked in black, the Undertaker was an enigma. His tall frame seemed to blend with the shadows, his face rarely seen beneath the brim of his wide hat. He was the keeper of the dead, yet his presence in the graveyard was far from ordinary. No one knew where he came from or what drove him to this solitary life, but they all knew one thing: his eyes held stories that no one dared to ask about. The graveyard had been his home for as long as anyone could remember, and its quiet decay mirrored his own existence. He walked the paths between the tombstones with the kind of reverence only death could inspire. His hands, pale and weathered from years of work, moved with precision as he tended to the graves, always careful, always deliberate, as though every action was a ritual. His life had been shaped by loss, by the relentless march of time that claimed everything he held dear. But the Undertaker was not a man who gave in to grief. He had buried his heart long ago, alongside his loved ones, and had become a fixture in the graveyard, as unmovable as the stones themselves. To the villagers, he was a myth, an almost spectral figure, never seen during the day, always at work when the night descended. They spoke of him in hushed tones, as if his very name carried the weight of death itself. Yet there was more to the Undertaker than the cold, distant persona he projected. Beneath the dark, stoic exterior, there was a man who had once loved deeply, who had once laughed and cried, who had once been human. But those days were long behind him. The death of his beloved had fractured him, leaving him only with the work, burying the dead, tending to the memories, and fading further into the shadows. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, the Undertaker paused by a fresh grave. His hand lingered over the mound of earth, the coldness of it seeping into his fingers. It was another life buried, another soul lost. The work was never done. But today felt different. In the distance, a figure emerged from the mist that clung to the graveyard. The stranger moved with purpose, his silhouette dark against the fading light. The Undertaker's instincts flared. He had not expected company, not this late, and certainly not someone who would venture into the heart of his domain. The stranger's arrival stirred something deep within the Undertaker, a restless feeling that he could not explain. He turned, his sharp gaze fixed on the approaching figure, sensing that this night, the one that had begun like any other, was about to change. And in that moment, he knew the peace of the graveyard would soon be shattered. The arrival of the stranger. The stranger's boots pressed into the wet soil with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step echoing through the hollow stillness of the graveyard. Mist clung to his coat, and though dusk had settled thick over the land, the gleam in his eyes cut through the dim light with unsettling clarity. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wander. He moved as if he knew exactly where he was going, and exactly whom he had come to find. The Undertaker watched from a distance, motionless beside a broken headstone, his gloved hands resting on the handle of his spade. He had seen all manner of grief-stricken visitors and lost wanderers, but this man wasn't either. There was no sorrow in his gait, no confusion in his eyes. He walked like someone who had returned to a familiar place, someone who had unfinished business with the dead. As the stranger drew closer, the tension between them thickened, unspoken but palpable. The Undertaker straightened, allowing the faint crunch of his boots to announce his presence. "You're far from the road," the Undertaker said, his voice low, deliberate. The stranger stopped a few paces away, his expression unreadable. "I'm exactly where I need to be." They stood facing one another beneath the twisted limbs of a dying tree. The stranger looked younger than the Undertaker, but not by much. Time had drawn lines on his face, but his eyes held something sharper, resentment, perhaps, or knowledge forged in the heat of pain. "People don't come here at this hour," the Undertaker continued. "Not unless they have a reason." "I have one," the stranger replied, his voice steady. "I'm looking for a grave." The Undertaker's brow tightened beneath his hat. "Whose?" The stranger paused. "Doesn't matter. I'll know it when I see it." It wasn't the answer the Undertaker expected. Something about the man's presence scraped against old wounds, wounds he thought long buried. Still, he nodded and stepped aside, watching as the stranger moved deeper into the rows of stones, his fingers brushing against the names etched into marble. Minutes passed in silence. Then the stranger stopped before a particular grave, unmarked, covered in moss. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. "You buried them here, didn't you?" he asked without turning around. "No name. No words. Just dirt and memory." The Undertaker felt a jolt in his chest, subtle but sharp. He didn't respond. The stranger turned to face him. "You remember me, don't you?" The Undertaker's silence spoke louder than words. Yes, he remembered. But how the stranger had found him here, how he had known where to look, was a question that lingered heavily in the air. The wind shifted. The quiet of the graveyard now felt fragile, like glass under pressure. "I didn't come here to mourn," the stranger said. "I came to make sure you haven't forgotten what you did." With that, he turned his back and walked into the darkness between the graves, leaving the Undertaker standing still, shaken, exposed, and deeply uncertain of what came next. The truth revealed. The Undertaker didn't move for several moments after the stranger vanished into the fog. His thoughts churned like unsettled soil, memories clawing their way to the surface, memories he had spent years trying to bury. But the past, it seemed, had found a voice. By morning, the stranger returned, standing at the edge of the graveyard like a challenge left unanswered. This time, the Undertaker approached him with less caution and more resolve. The graveyard was his domain, but this man had arrived with the power to unravel it. "You speak as if you know me," the Undertaker said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of fatigue rather than menace. "I do," the stranger replied. "Or at least, I knew who you were before you vanished." The Undertaker studied the stranger's face. In the light of dawn, the resemblance became impossible to deny. His eyes, that sharp defiance in his jaw, faint reflections of someone long gone. "You're her brother," the Undertaker whispered. A bitter smile twisted the stranger's lips. "You remember, then?" The name hung unspoken between them. Elena. The woman who had once filled the Undertaker's world with light, who had walked into his life with laughter and left it with silence. Her death had been sudden, too sudden. A carriage accident, they said. A broken wheel. A storm. The Undertaker had buried her himself, with shaking hands and eyes too dry for tears. The pain had been too large, too loud. So he had turned away from the world and made a home among the dead. "I looked for you," the brother said. "After the funeral. After everyone else forgot. You disappeared. Just like that." "I had nothing left," the Undertaker said, the words scraped from his throat like rusted nails. "I couldn't stay in that world. Not after her." "You left her without a name," the brother said, voice rising. "Buried her like a stranger. No headstone. No marker. Nothing." The Undertaker's hands clenched. "I couldn't bring myself to carve it. To see it. Her name, it would have made it real. Final. She deserved more than a nameless grave," the stranger snapped. "She deserved remembrance. Not this exile." Silence settled again, but this time it was heavier, pregnant with grief and blame. "I came here," the brother said, voice softer now, "not just for her, but for you. To understand why a man who once loved her with everything vanished like a coward." The Undertaker looked away, his eyes fixed on the unmarked grave. "I didn't know how to grieve her. So I buried myself, too." The stranger exhaled slowly. "Then maybe it's time you stopped hiding. If not for her, then for yourself." They stood side by side now, the grave between them, no longer adversaries but two broken pieces of the same story. The Undertaker didn't answer, but for the first time, his shoulders slackened, as if the weight he carried had finally shifted. And as the sun broke through the clouds, faint and pale, the brother spoke again. "Tomorrow, I'll bring a stone. The final decision." The following morning arrived cloaked in quiet stillness. Dew clung to the grass, and the graveyard, usually indifferent to the passing of time, seemed to hold its breath. The Undertaker stood near Elena's grave, his hands ungloved, dirt embedded in the lines of his palms. For the first time in years, he wasn't working. He was waiting. The stranger returned, carrying a small slab of stone wrapped in burlap. He approached without speaking, setting it gently at the base of the unmarked grave. With deliberate care, he peeled back the cloth to reveal the inscription. Elena Durrell, beloved sister. Gone, not forgotten. The Undertaker's breath caught. The sight of her name etched in stone, simple, unadorned, struck him like a final bell toll. It was permanent. It was real. And it hurt. She didn't need flowers or statues, the stranger said softly. Just acknowledgement. Just truth. The Undertaker knelt slowly, brushing his fingers along the carved name. Grief, long compressed into silence, rose in waves. He had buried hundreds, perhaps thousands, but none like her. No ritual, no prayer, no words had ever been enough. He'd thought forgetting would numb the pain. Instead, it had deepened it. I should have done this years ago, he murmured. You still can, the brother replied. There's more to you than this.